Dorothy Zopp is, of course, a Yellow Springs resident. She and her husband George lived down on Jacoby Road at 68 for many years. They've got a bunch of kids, and I think at least one of them's here, aren't you? Back there? I thought so. So they're back here. Dorothy is back in this area because when they left for New Mexico 10 years ago, she began getting interested in quilting and has built up virtually all of her knowledge about this particular craft over the last 10 years, so that it's been since she left Yellow Springs that she's developed it. Some of you may remember the hikes that Dorothy had developed and led through Yellow Springs before she left on some of the older buildings and some of the history. I think she was the first person that told me that Yellow Springs had a chewing gum factory. So she's well versed in history, and now that she's back here for a showing down in Kentucky. Some city down there, I forget the name of it. Paducah, thank you. Paducah, Kentucky, where she is one of their honored presenters, and because she is close friends with Jane and Bill Baker, they managed to convince her to come up here and give us some presentations. So without further ado, I'd like to present Dorothy Zopp.
Oh, that was wonderful and heartwarming. And I do want to reiterate my appreciation to the Yellow Springs Historical Society and to the Yellow Springs Arts Council. It's just fabulous to be here. It really is. And there's one more person that I have to name, and that's Andy Benning, who spent the morning with me going over these myriad little buttons here. And I'm supposed to know exactly what's going to happen. You see? Interesting, isn't it?
Where's Andy? There he is.
What on the wide earth have I done? Now this should turn off. Now we've got a dark room. Now I'd like to turn on the projectors. Maybe the power goes on first? No?
There's something to it there. We've got some lights up here, Dorothy. We've got something up here. We did.
We got to focus on me now. It may not be in the spot. There you go. There you go.
There we go.
Great. Okay.
Okay? Good.
Thank you very much, Andy. You see what an apt pupil I am? I'm used to being the teacher instead.
Don't forget to use the mic.
Sorry. Thank you, Julie. Keep after me. These quilts that I'm going to show you are not technically beautiful. They are what are called sugans. S-U-G-A-N in Webster, S-U-G-G-A-N in the Oxford English Dictionary, and in the spelling of the phonetic Southwest, it's any sprinkling of vowels that you like between an S, a G, and an N. Truly. O's, I's, any old thing works. And the most fun about it all has been that every time I asked an old-timer, did he remember sugans, there was a big smile. So most of what I have in terms of information was gathered from many, many interviews and tape recordings. A few old photographs. People were not proud of these quilts. A sugan is, from the Gaelic, a rough blanket. And they were used for sleeping out of doors. Everybody had 5 or 6 of them to roll up in, and if he was fortunate, there was also a tarpaulin around the outside, but that was not always the case. Hence, around that evening campfire, the blankets were spread to dry, and it made, I'm sure, quite a scene at night. You'll see a few old photographs where you have to hunt for these quilts. I will try to point them out to you, or at least the little squiggle on that slide that I think represents a quilt inside the tarp. We'll see. But anyway, let's begin, and you will understand everything. Thank you, Andy. One of the things about these quilts is that they had to be made very quickly. In the early days, with the big herds and having only horses for transportation, as opposed to a pickup truck and so on. The men were out for long periods of time, and a lot of men were involved. At 5 per man, that was a tremendous number of quilts. I want you to understand that the women who made these quilts made beautiful, lovely, in their home quilts also. But these were the rough and ready numbers. And to me, in many ways, it's an abstract expression of that woman's personality. Josefa Rodriguez, here on the left, is still a bouncy lady. She's in her late 80s and absolutely delightful. She refers to this as a potato blanket, which means that the men in her family went as migrant labor to harvest in the potato fields. But it's the same kind of sleeping out of doors with an equal number of sugans under you as on top of you. On the right, Adelia Cisneros made this one in the 1940s. And I was interested especially in it because if you begin to look at the ties, she has used every little scrap of every color she could get hold of. I know it's just dreaming, but I like to think that she probably was also a very good cook, putting a pinch of this and a pinch of that in. Beatriz Quintana, Josefa's sister, seems to have been a bit of a slug-a-bed because this quilt is patterned after the ceiling of an adobe house. The big long vigas, those logs that go from wall to wall, and then the small branches that were peeled off the trunks of the trees, forming the cross pieces. On the right, Mary Joyce Fidel made this, and no one would have had to tell me that that was her work, because she is the straightest, most dependable, absolutely even-tempered person I've ever met. And I think that shows up in her quilt, even though these were made in a day.
Made what, in a day?
Did you repeat that? How long did it take her to make that?
One day.
We thought that's what
You could not afford more time than that. Saturday you'll see quilts where time was spent, but not tonight. Oh no, and we've got some sterling examples of speed coming along. Anyway, when I talk about the Southwest, I thought maybe it would be a good idea to define it. To me, and to folklorists in general, it is geographically bounded by the panhandle of Texas on the east, the Mogollon Escarpment of Arizona on the west, the Sonoran Desert of Old Mexico, and a tad of Texas on the south, and up well into Colorado, where the Rockies reach their climax. This was a very isolated area. World War II fortunately ended that isolation. It brought paved roads and another way of life that replaced these self-sufficient ways, the tremendous distances, and the incredible hardship. But I like to think that when I'm interviewing these old-timers, that they're very proud of having survived. So whether you were a cowman or a shepherd, a hired hand or the owner of the spread, you had to take care of yourself. The quilts were either made in the saddle by the cowboy, which meant a lighter weight fabric, or they were made at home on the treadle sewing machine. This one on the left, by Estefanita Lopez, was done in the 1930s. And it's interesting because she obviously had the extended family with her that day. This is a nice tied quilt. She had a couple of old coats that she was going to make this wool cover from. However, twilight was coming on, the shadows were getting longer, and right there in the middle, where it looks kind of like worms, she was missing a piece of wool. Undaunted, resourceful, whatever you want to call it, she took up her shears, stepped out into the barnyard, and removed a section from the family ram. Couched it down with cheesecloth, And this quilt has been saved solely because the children and the grandchildren rubbed it to death and wouldn't let it disappear. The quilt on the right, Amelia calls this a floor quilt, something to put down when things are a little dirty, perhaps, on the dirt floor there. And I defy you, or maybe that's too bold a statement. I have never succeeded in figuring out where she started to put this quilt together. I see no pattern in it. I borrowed it from her for a whole weekend, and I still don't know. Oh well, so it goes. After the hay was in came the roundup. Now I told you about finding quilt corners in old photographs. The early 90s, you understand, is the 1890s here. And the trail boss, the gentleman sitting to the side of the wagon beside his wife, if you look under his left heel, there's a piece of a quilt sticking out of a tarp. I have no idea the pattern or anything else, but I was ecstatic when I found this. It proved that what they were talking about was true. Alberta Fouts from southern Colorado said, he sat, that's the cowboy, sat for hours at a time at the edge of the herd, his rifle in its sheath. He depended on the dogs to warn of wild predators. If it was a quiet day, the cowboy would get out his strips of fabric and sew them together with big, crude stitches. They were out in good weather and bad, and as Agnes Morley Cleveland said in her book, No Life for a Lady, the weight of that bedroll was something to ponder. It was vastly more comfortable than your modern sleeping bag, defying wind and weather, snakes and beetles, a retreat to which its owner could repair and feel that all was secure. Thank you for your patience. As you can see with the sheep herders, it was the custom to take out a caravan. They stayed the year round, for the most part, so that a tarpaulin was not important, but sougans were very, very important. As Mark Brown said, in extremely cold weather, about the only way the herder could keep his potatoes from freezing was to put them in bed with him at night and wrap them in his bedding during the day. These are Basque sheep herders and wagons, and for the most part, the big flocks nowadays are up in Idaho and Montana. However, at the turn of the century, the flocks in northern New Mexico numbered in the thousands. Today, as these pictures show, they're small numbers. A few for food for the family, the extended family, and some wool for anybody who's still weaving or carding a bat to put inside a nice quilt. A severe drought in New Mexico in the early part of the century changed the grazing pattern as well as the taste of the American people. We went from mutton to beef and from wool to synthetics. So there just isn't the call for the sheep that there once was. However, at one shepherd per every 1,000 sheep, and we know there were hundreds of thousands, let's just take 100, multiply by 5, that's 500 quilts that season. A lot of quilts, a lot of sougans were made. And the phrase quilt in a day on television was not facetious at all. Sougans, bedrolls, were used indoors also. In the bunkhouse, radiating smoke fashion from the stove, or at the rodeo, or here you see them, the San Antonio County Fair in 1934. These youngsters probably have 4-H entries in the fair. On the right, another potato blanket. What were these sougans made out of? Many people call them breeches quilts. And I think you can see the blue jeans being used to advantage on the left. And on the right, we know that this is a much older slide, probably around the time of the First World War, because this is a wool quilt, smaller squares, made from the old pieces of wool suiting. It's a reasonable way to guess at the age of a quilt, whether it be wool or denim. This breeches quilt on the left was made from the suits that Aurora's husband bought at the general store in Ocatay, New Mexico, out on the state plains. Another source of good material was family clothing. Anita Wiggins did this one over in Wagon Mound. And Alberta describes the situation. She said the cowboys used the sleeves of their shirts and any other good parts and feed sacks. Many times they used fabric that came in the mail, samples from Sears or Ward's. Another source, of course, was flour sacks. They were either squared up or torn in strips. And both of these were made over in Mora in the 40s. How did they go about making them? On the left, it appears that Vera started with a square in the middle and just kept adding borders. Whereas the one on the right, which was made in the 30s, has strips, long strips that go from border to border. Probably the more common method, as a matter of fact. However, that's not the only kind of quilts there were. String quilts were very popular because they used odd sizes and the tiniest scraps could be incorporated. The quilt on the right, made about 1910 in the panhandle of Texas, has tobacco bags for the sashing, as it's called, the white strips between the blocks. They were an excellent source of fabric. Did they ever use block patterns from back east? Yes, they did. Not often, but occasionally. These two slides come from the same period in history. They are from the 1890s. I'm showing you the one on the left so that you will know what you're looking for in the one on the right. And I think that you can see that. You may call that a pinwheel pattern, but out west that's known as a windmill. And it is the quilt in the lower right-hand corner. Why was windmill such a favorite? Well, you know, after you took up your homestead and had dug the well, installed the pump, built the tower, and in 1897 from Sears Roebuck paid anywhere from $100 to $200 for a set of blades. To have that installed called for a celebration and a commemoration. And it's a pattern that is still very popular. The quilt on the right was made by Aurelia V. Hill in 1990. Now this is the only quilt I've come across, oh, this is my most exciting, that was actually made in the field, so to speak. It was done in the year 1923. The shepherdess was 12 years old. She lived in Trementina, New Mexico, which is out on the plains, the eastern plains, and her father had entrusted her with his flock. She had apparently a couple of very good dogs because she took her scraps of fabric, her little flat iron, built a fire, ironed on a smooth stone, and gave us these wonderful silhouettes of her cat. And being a little quick with my tongue sometimes, I said, "Ooh, this quilt must be called El Gato." "Oh no," said the family, "not at all. She called this La Estrella, the star." And if you begin to look carefully, you'll notice that there are stars scattered, not in any particular pattern, but I like to think perhaps the way they look to her, lying on the ground at night, looking up. La Estrella. You'll notice her stitches on the right, very small basting stitches, but then later on someone went over it on the sewing machine at home, which is one reason that the quilt has survived. The filling for these quilts could be absolutely anything. And in this case, it's old clothing. If you look to the quilt on the right, you'll see an apron hanging out of there. It's got some curved bias tape on the edge of it. Big basting stitches to hold the filling together. Another comfort we found, made in Rainsville, had a serape inside. And since this quilt dates from about 1900, there's no reason not to believe that the woman who made the quilt also was the woman who wove that serape, wore it nearly to extinction, and then gave it a cover so that it could go on with its useful life. Today, her great-grandsons use this to go camping. On the right, one of Beatrice Quintana's quilts, and there's no filling. Something was better than nothing. Now, I'm sure you've noticed that these quilts are predominantly tied together. You can recognize what's happening in the right-hand slide, but I can talk about the left-hand one. A tobacco bag, be it Bull Durham, Duke, or Dookie, as they call it, Golden Grain, whatever the brand, was a prized piece of new material. And you see the size of those little strips that they were willing to unravel, iron, and use. However, there's something else to a tobacco bag, and that is that gorgeous yellow drawstring. Josefa Rodriguez used 176 yellow ties to do this quilt. That's the equivalent of 44 bags of tobacco. I don't know whether she smoked them all or whether the men in her family helped her along a little bit. But as you probably know, it's not uncommon for the Spanish women to smoke. This is the back and front of the same quilt. However, everybody wasn't fortunate enough to have a heavy smoker around, and so one of the most common sources of white string was from the flour sacks. Pull on that chain stitch, and you have some wonderful white ties for your quilt. This was the popular way to fasten them together. The extended family was there, and it could be done in 30-40 minutes. I can attest to that because we tried it one day. These are not terribly large quilts either. They're made for just one person to wrap up in. No king-size beds involved. However, sometimes the extended family waned, as it were, and in this left-hand quilt, you'll see that Josefa just made long passes on the sewing machine. About 5 of them from border to border to hold that together. And then, of course, there are the hand-quilted quilts. And this was a Sugan. It was considered a rough and ready, not an elegant quilt. On the left, two parties are represented. One, a wonderful dancing party, and up at the ceiling, the party that's to come tomorrow. Do you see the quilting frame up there? It's the dark wood going around the corner, and the quilt has just begun to be quilted in that one corner. As Alberta said, the farm hands slept in the bunkhouse, but we all ate together. After supper, well, the women did the dishes, the men smoked outside. Then the quilting frame was rolled down, and everybody sat around that frame to laugh and work and sing. A man came into the hacienda in Taos where I was demonstrating one day, a middle-aged man, and he said very, very proudly, "I learned to quilt when I was 5 years old. We all helped my mama. I was good too. Sat right up there with my older brother and all the others." Now he happened to have a friend with him who in a very loud aside said, "I held out till I was 8, but there was nothing else to do except go to bed or learn to quilt." The evening's entertainment. The care of these quilts. Vicenta Lucero in Lumberton, when it was a thriving town, she now lives in Albuquerque, and she told me that she tried to air all of the quilts once a year and hoped to get them washed at least every other year. Now, we're not talking the fancy in-house quilts. These are the old Sugans, you know. But river water was used, and it was the young children who carried the task of bringing up the water. You did that the day before so the sun would warm it, and then they were ready to wash it early the next morning. One lovely young woman said, "I hated the last day of school because I knew that the next morning my grandma would be there, ready for my services to wash all her quilts." Two sides of the same quilt. It was made in the 30s, and I brought it especially here because it may well have been one of the quilts that Reyes Martinez speaks about in his WPA Writers Project story. He said, "The women cooperated in the washing at the river of their blankets and mattresses twice a year, in the spring and in the fall, when the spread of drying blankets formed a curious display on the fences of the village." I found this particular quilt when I bought an old roll-away bed. It was between the mattress and the bed springs. And you can see the pattern. Her husband did not own a plaid suit entirely. Much of that is rust marks. And so, whether they're used in a bedroll, in a wagon, in the sleigh, in a pickup, for the root cellar, at harvest time in the fields, when the men go out fighting fires, for camping, hunting, picnicking, these are the unsung heroes of the West. And I want you to know that I even heard of one indoor use for these. Lazel Johnson told me that Mama never spoke mean, but if we'd done something to disappoint her, we knew when she tucked us in, because one of those heavy old camp quilts would be slapped down over the covers on our bed. These are the two sides of the same quilt. Annie Fernandez made these quilts by the hundreds to bring in cash to pay their taxes when her husband was between sheep and cattle. And that was a hard transition for many, many old Spanish people to do. And Alberta said, "In my mind's eye, I can still see the rancher, his wife and daughters, and the hands around the quilting frame, laughing and stomping, talking and singing. It would have been a 6-hour ride to the movies, and nobody had the money anyway." And do you have any questions, comments, personal stories? Ever slept in Sugans in a tarp?
What is the earliest that you know that they were actually, I mean, is it ancient from the 1500s? Or?
Oh, no.
It's an American tradition.
It's an American tradition, and for the Southwest, it did not come until the railroad and free public delivery of mail, which meant they had a Sears Roebuck or a Montgomery Ward catalog, known out there as Monkey Ward, and you could buy manufactured clothing. Their homespun did not lend itself to being cut up and resewn in small pieces. It was manufactured clothing that changed their lives. The railroad entered New Mexico in 1880, and it was pretty much spread over the state by 1885. Most of these towns had post offices, but the mail had only been delivered perhaps once a month at most. It wasn't until Congress enacted the free rural delivery that times really changed. And as you can see, these are not traditional quilt patterns. They used what they had, and they used the inspiration from their surroundings. For the most part, what I've showed you were made by Spanish ladies, because I happen to live in an area where they are the predominant population. But Sugans existed on the range all over the state. I just haven't gotten down there yet. Down to the southern part, I should say. Yes, ma'am.
Well, these remind me of the Australian bonnets.
Precisely. Same concept, exactly.
If you had photos of that, people would really see the parallels. And for the same reasons you told me.
Mm-hmm. And in the eastern United States, they are known as HAPs, H-A-P.
I'm sorry, I missed the label Australian what?
Say the word for us.
Wada.
Wadas.
Wada. W-A-G-E-A. But that spelling was sometimes one way and sometimes another way. So.
Another one of those phonetic situations in this world. Wadas have become very popular collector items. I cannot imagine that Sugans will ever reach that stature because there just aren't enough of them. But the Museum of International Folk Art in Santa Fe is working very hard currently to purchase this quilt and one that is made with tobacco sacks. For the most part, if they've survived, there's some deep family attachment to the product, and the families do not want to give them up. Plus the fact it makes good stuffing for the next quilt. You know, let's face facts. Can't afford to be flippant. Other? Well, this has been fascinating to talk with you, and obviously a very knowledgeable audience. I look forward, I hope, to seeing some of the same faces on Saturday, and to see some of your actual quilts hanging out here in the foyer.
That's going to be exciting. Huh?
Yes,
And I
yes.
want to thank Dorothy very much.